welcome back. So, we're still continuing on trig graphs today, and today we are going to be looking more into the amplitude. But to start, we're going to graph the sine and cosine functions. It's going to be on the next slide. Now, I'm going to graph this without the use of the chart. We can do that as long as we really know the shapes of both graphs. So I'm going to turn back to the front for a second. I do want to talk about what the sine graph looks like. So the sine graph starts at the midline. It goes up, it goes below, and then it ends at the midline. It kind of looks like an S a little bit. And then the cosine graph starts above the midline, goes below, and then ends above the midline. All right, now the midline. We haven't looked too much into it, but it is the middle of the graph. So it would be like that for the sine and the cosine. So using that information, we're going to graph sine first. So we're graphing regular sine. So the midline is just going to be the x-axis. So we start here. Then we go up to 1. Now I'm going to make 1 over here and negative 1 down here. So it goes 0, then 1, then 0, then negative 1, then 0. That's the sine graph. And then we're going to go in the opposite way. So it was at 0, then we should go back down, then 0, then up, then 0. It should follow along the same pattern. And then we connect. Remember, connect with nice, smooth lines. Now, we were able to graph that without even using the table at all. It's just by knowing the pattern. So now let's look at cosine. So for cosine, we start at 1. And then it goes 1, 0, negative 1, 0, 1. Going in the opposite direction, we plot our points still. Same pattern. And then we connect using a nice, smooth, curved line. So if you know the difference with how sine looks to how cosine looks, you can graph these without really even looking at the table. You just need to know the pattern and the curve. Now let's look at these 3 questions. What is the domain? What is the range? What is the period? So, first let's start with domain. Kind of a little refresher here, it's been a while. Domain are your x values. So it goes from leftmost point to rightmost point. There's a couple of ways that we can write the domain. The first way is using brackets and parentheses. You use brackets when you include the point. So our leftmost point was negative 2 pi. So that's where our domain will start. Our rightmost point was 2 pi. So that's where our domain will end. Another way you can write it is, see if I can, I'll move it over here. You can write it as negative 2 pi less than or equal to x less than or equal to 2 pi. So that's another way you can write the domain. Both are perfectly good answers. Next is, what is the range? So the range are now your y values. So we have to look at the lowest point to the highest point. There's going to be the 2 representations, exactly how we did domain. So our lowest point here is negative 1 for both graphs. Our highest point is 1. The other way to write it is using interval notation like we did before. Negative 1 less than or equal to, instead of x we can use y, less than or equal to 1. So again, both representations are great ways to write the domain or the range. Now, lastly, what is the period? So this was a definition from yesterday. The period is the time it takes to complete one cycle. So how long does it take to complete one cycle? Now, if we look here at the graph, I'm going to go for sine. So we have to know what it looks like. For the sine graph, one complete cycle would end right here. So that tells us that our period is 2 pi. The same will apply for the cosine. To complete one full cycle on this graph, it ends right there at 2 pi. So the period here is 2 pi. So, little vocabulary review. We will be doing this every day because you need to know these vocabulary words. Amplitude, that's the distance between the midline and one of the extreme points. So again, extremum are either your max or min points. Vertical shift. Vertical shift is the translation of the graph up or down a certain number of units. So those are the two questions you should be asking yourself. Is it going up or down, and how many units? Period is what we just talked about, the length of one complete cycle. And frequency is the number of cycles in a given interval. So today we are going to be looking at the amplitude and how to graph it. So when you are given an equation, like so, written over there, sometimes you might have a coefficient in front of sine or cosine. That means that you will have a number in front. That number in front is your amplitude, okay? So to graph it, you first have to find your midline. Now, for today, our midline will always be, so for today, the midline will be at y equals 0, which is your x-axis. That is going to be changing in another lesson, but just for today, that's going to be our midline. Now, after you have your midline, you go a spaces to the max and a spaces to the min. I'm going to show you exactly what that means. So let's look at the first one. Now, what's graphed in black there is our standard cosine graph with no changes to it. So we're graphing y equals 3 cosine x. So from here, we can identify our amplitude to be 3. So that is your distance from the midline to the max or min. So our midline in this case is y equals 0, which is the x-axis. I'm just going over it in blue so we can see it. Now we have to think about our pattern. So our pattern for cosine, it starts at 1, right? But instead of it being 1, we are going to go up 3 spaces. So we go up 1, 2, 3. And that is our first point. Then we go 0. Then we go down 1, 2, 3. Then 0. And then 3. So this would be the graph of cosine with an amplitude of 3. Now we can go in the other directions if we'd like. So then we'd go 0, and then we'd go down 3, then back at the midline, and then up 3. So that would be a complete graph of cosine with the amplitude of 3. Now let's try another one. This time our amplitude is 3 over 2. Now, if you're not comfortable with fractions, that's okay. 3 over 2 is the same thing as 1.5. So that tells us that our distance between the midline and the max, or the midline and the min, is 1.5. So again, I'm going to first mark our midline, which for today is the x-axis. And now we're going to graph our points. We're still looking at cosine. So the pattern is first we are above the midline. But now instead of being above it at 1, we're above it at 1.5. Then we have back to the midline, then 1 point below 1.5, midline, above 1.5. And then we connect. And this is one cycle of 3 over 2 cosine x. And we can go in the other direction too. So midline, below 1.5, midline, above 1.5. And that is our cosine graph. If you have a negative, the graph is actually flipped around. So what we're going to do here is we're first going to just plot what the regular sign would look like, and then we're going to go from there. So I'm just going to do this very quickly, very simply. So sine usually starts at 0, and then it goes to 1, 0, negative 1, 0. And I can go in both directions. Okay? Now, first thing we would have to do here is still plot our midline. So again, our midline for today will be the x-axis. So I'm just going to graph that. Now, if you were to flip 0 over, it still stays 0. All the points on the midline never change. It's the maximum and minimum points that change. So our amplitude is not negative 3, it's just positive 3. The negative tells us to flip the graph. So this point here, instead of it being above the x-axis, it's actually going to be flipped to below. So it's going to be below, and to get to that point, we're going to go 3 units, which is our amplitude. So it's going to be 1, 2, 3. That will be the new point for the one that has the arrow attached to it. And then all of the rest are going to follow the same way. So now this point here, let me just get rid of this arrow. That point there, instead of being below, it's going to be above. And we have to go 3 points above. So 1, 2, 3. Now, get rid of that arrow. We're not looking at that point anymore. We're looking at this one now. So, I don't know why I can't move it anymore. There we go. So that arrow here, instead of being below, it's going to be above. And we use the amplitude to go up 1, 2, 3. And now the last point that we have to look at, which is this one. Instead of being above, it's going to be below 1, 2, 3. So now I'm just going to erase all the black points. So we just have our new points. And I'm going to connect them with a nice smooth line. Okay, so if you were to compare this to the regular sine graph, you'd see that it is kind of flipped over the x-axis there. All right, let's do one more. Now what I suggest is if you're just given a blank graph, I suggest kind of looking at what the normal graph would look like and then base your new graph off that. So for this example here, our amplitude is 4, okay? Now, again, always starting with the midline. You don't always have to draw it over. I like doing it so I can identify where my points come from. I'm going to plot what the normal sign would look like. Now, normally, sign would go 0, 1, 0, -1, 0. I'm not going to connect this. I'm just going to use this as a guide. Now, we don't want regular sign. We want 4 sine x. So to get from the midline to our max, we're going up 4 spaces. So here, we would go up 1, 2, 3, 4. So that's how we will get to our maximum point. And then we would go down 1, 2, 3, 4. Notice how all the black points on the midline, so the ones that I'm drawing arrows to, those never change. The points on the midline are always going to stay on the midline. Now, let's connect what this graph looks like. So we go up, down, and then back up. Now, if you want to go in the other direction, you can continue it to go on the other side. But I'm going to make just one cycle of sine for this example. Okay, now to get credit for this class, you have to complete this check for understanding question. It says, which of the following equations represents the periodic curve shown below? It's a multiple choice question, so you need to match this graph with the multiple choice question. Now there is going to be one other question that you will have to do. It's going to be practicing graphing. So you will also have to complete this problem as a check for understanding. So upload these 2 questions onto Google Classroom in order to get credit. Thank you. Have a great day.